Hello, I'm Dr. Bradshaw, and today I'm going to be talking about how to help our children recover from trauma and different types of trauma. I couldn't be with you in person, and I'm sorry about that, and I hope that I can join you in the near future. But for now, I can be with you via video, and praise God for wonderful technology that we can do this. So welcome to our training on trauma and helping children. First, I'd like to start by helping you understand there are different forms of trauma. So as we talk about trauma with anyone, children, adults, there are different types. Now, as I write on the board, I invite you to take your own notes, or once I've completed a session here and what we're talking about, then you can, if you have a phone that has the capacity to take photos, that might be a good option as well. I'm going to be breaking this up in different videos. Okay, so we're going to start with video 1 here. And we'll be breaking down the different types of trauma and the effect that these traumas have on children as they're growing up, okay? And then we will move into the second video and we will begin to discuss how we help these young people address the trauma and heal from and recover from what they've gone through, okay? So let's start by identifying the types of trauma. So I'm going to try to write legibly. I'm not good with writing on the board, I'll just tell you right now. And my penmanship is not always the best, but I'll do my best for you. Okay, so types of trauma. Okay, see what I mean? Even though I'm a professor, my students always give me a hard time about my penmanship. So let's look at the first one, which is emotional trauma. Okay, so emotional trauma or abuse, we can list emotional trauma / abuse. Okay, and I'll come back around to that and I'll explain what I mean by that. Because we talk about trauma can result from exposure to violence within the home or outside of the home in the community. So trauma can result from a child or a person being exposed or what they see. But trauma can also result from these different types of abuse that I'm going to talk about here. Emotional, there's an emotional abuse / trauma, okay? There's also a physical trauma / abuse, okay? And sexual trauma, abuse, okay? And then the last one that we'll look at is a verbal trauma or abuse. Okay, I hope you all can see that. I'll step out of the way. Again, my apologies for how poorly I write on the board. But let's break these down. Now, again, let me clarify. A trauma does not have to be the result of abuse, okay? For instance, if a child or an individual witnesses somebody being killed or witnesses somebody being harmed, that can lead to trauma and the development of what we call post-traumatic stress disorder, okay? But abuse, if the person is abused, then that always leads to trauma, okay? So they've been traumatized by abuse, okay? I hope that makes sense. And therefore, that can result in post-traumatic stress disorder. Does it always lead to PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder? No, not always, but very high percentage, okay? And we will definitely be coming back around to that, but I want to stay focused here for a moment on the different types of abuse. So let me give you an example of emotional. This is more in the mental capacity, the emotions, so what the young person is feeling, what they've experienced. This could be from, let's say, individuals just told terrible things when they're growing up, verbally. Maybe they've been put down by their family or caregivers. Maybe they've been told awful things. This can also happen for adults. I do see this happen for women. This is a very common abuse of women who are in marriages, relationships where their spouse may be telling them horrible things about them, maybe that they're not attractive anymore, maybe that they're not smart, or so you get my point that the emotional part is very powerful. In fact, some research suggests that the emotional trauma can be more devastating and lead to long-term effects more than even physical abuse or trauma, okay? So it's important that we consider the emotional piece here and what the young person or individual has been exposed to. Physical trauma. So this is, as it says, physical. So an individual or a child who has been abused, they have physically been hurt by caregivers or someone else. They may have even been in a situation, I've had patients where they've been in a car accident. In fact, I'm treating one young lady right now who experienced a physical trauma from a car accident, and she had a head injury, not severe, but severe enough to cause her to not be able to drive. She's at home. So the physical trauma has led to some behavioral issues for her, such as not wanting to leave her home and things like that. So that's the physical trauma or physical abuse. Sexual trauma or abuse is, as you know, it says here, where the young person or individual is sexually assaulted or sexually molested or used by someone else in a sexual way. This trauma is very, very destructive and can last for years and years. I have worked with many women who experienced sexual trauma, sexual abuse in their childhood, and they have carried the wounds. And I'm not even saying scars, because scars are once something is healed, but open wounds that have really created major issues for women. Yes, we can see those wounds healed. Yes, we can address this, and we need to, because true healing, God can bring true healing to the individual who has experienced sexual trauma. And yes, statistically, more women and more girls are sexually assaulted and sexually traumatized than men or boys, but the abuse of boys is still does occur, and it's actually on the rise. So if you're working with children, boys and girls, don't make the assumption that the boy has not been abused. Now, he's not going to want to talk about it. You know, of course, the girl doesn't want to either, but she is more open and will be more apt to share in confidence what has happened. And with the boy, much more difficult. But we'll come back around to that when we discuss our actual approach and helping, how we can be help young people and children come through the different types of trauma. Okay. Lastly is verbal. So again, this is very similar. Verbal is similar to emotional, but it's again where a young person may be told terrible things about themselves, that maybe they are not worth anything, maybe they can't do anything right, maybe they're not smart. I've seen kids traumatized with verbal abuse from adults, and it's so tragic, and again, very powerful. This goes very deep and affects their emotional state, okay? And the verbal messages that these young people are given, that kids are given, that stick with them and stay with them for years if they're not able to get with somebody who can really help them and actually correct the messages. And as we come back around, we'll talk about the approach and how we help our young people come through all of these different types of traumas. But the one thing about verbal abuse is it's like there's a recording in their mind. So the young person has this almost like a tape playing of the things that have been said to them. Or an adult. I've seen many women, unfortunately, who have been in abusive relationships, come from abusive homes and situations where they have this constant tape running in their head of the verbal, abuse that they've endured. And so those messages, those false verbal messages, need to be corrected and replaced with what is true about them, right? Which is God's love and that they are incredible people that God created. Okay, so, all right, so this is the different types of trauma. And so let's go ahead and now take a look at how these different types of traumas affect our young people, okay? So emotional, and I'm going to link the emotional and the verbal together, okay? So these two, emotional and verbal, are, like I said, they're much more powerful than even the physical abuse. From what I have seen working for over 13 years with patients and all different ages, is it's a real struggle to replace the correct message about the individual, okay? So, for instance, in my example a moment ago, a young person may have been told, you're not pretty, or you're not smart, you're stupid, you can't do anything, and these messages will play over and over in their mind and will affect how they feel emotionally about themselves, and then they will act on that. Okay, so then they will behave in ways that according to what their message is. So, for instance, in the example, if a young boy or young girl was told that they're not smart, we'll just take that example, then they're going to believe that, and then when it comes to school or doing other things, their behavior is going to reflect what they believe, okay? So if a child believes, based on the emotional and verbal trauma, if they believe that they are not capable of doing something, if they believe that they're not worth anything, if they have been rejected or left by their parents or by their caregivers, then their behavior is going to reflect what they believe, right? And so that's why it's so important that as we begin helping our young people, helping the kids, that we help them with what is true and change the message within themselves. And we'll get to that. So their behavior, maybe they don't try. So they may not try, maybe they don't study, or they don't try to do good. We also call this learned helplessness. Okay, learned helplessness. Sorry, I hope you all can see that. I hope you can see that. So they don't try, which means it's learned helplessness. So if they don't believe they can do it because they have been experienced, these different traumas, then they're going to give up, okay? So let's take a look at, how about physical abuse, physical trauma? If the young person has been physically assaulted, physically abused, and unfortunately I've over the years seen so much of this, it's so heartbreaking to me, then their way of looking at the world and looking at other adults is going to be very warped and not accurate. Okay, it's going to skew the way they view adults, right, and other people. So many young people will act out. Okay, they'll act out. And what do I mean by acting out? Again, behaviorally. So their behavior is going to reflect the treatment that they received, okay, from whoever that person was, a caregiver, strangers, depending on what has happened and who has abused them. Now let me make a note here for you all. This is very important. Research suggests that the abuses within the home, and this is very pretty strong in the literature, that when abuse happens within the home, that is far more destructive for the young person. Okay, so for instance, if it's mom or dad or siblings or someone else within the home, that is going to leave deeper wounds and be much more difficult for that young person. Not impossible whatsoever to overcome. However, it's going to have a greater effect on them, okay? And so they will act out, and maybe some kids will bully other kids because that's what's been done to them, or they'll kind of go introverted, okay? So they'll do one of two things. They'll either act out behaviorally on other kids or others, you'll see that, or they will just kind of go within themselves, like just in a little shell, okay? Now, honestly, the kids that I've seen who act out, they're, it's a bit, as a psychologist, it's easier for me to treat them than the kid who goes inward, okay? When a kid goes inward, it's more difficult. We have to work extra hard to get them to open up and come out of their shell, okay? And so the sexual trauma, same thing. The acting out behavior, we see the behavior as they may act out toward others, other kids. So we've seen this many times where if a boy was molested as a young boy or assaulted sexually, he may turn around and in fact statistically a much higher rate of him acting out now toward other kids. Not always, but it is a higher statistic that happens. Or the same thing, they will go introverted. Okay, so they'll not want to talk about it. They'll go inward, and like I mentioned a moment ago, especially for boys, there's so much shame and embarrassment and all of that surrounding. In fact, sexual abuse and sexual trauma is all about shame. Okay, the shame and the guilt that the young person experiences, that's off the charts. Because even when we tell them, hey, it's not your fault, you didn't do anything wrong, there is still this within that young person, the question of why did this happen? What did I do to make this happen? So that becomes our challenge as for myself as a psychologist, but for you folks and people who are working with children and trying to help them along the way. That becomes a real challenge there, is how to really convince them that no, this was not their fault. Okay, and we have specific strategies and techniques how we can help the young people and kids be able to come through that place of shame and guilt, and we're going to get to that. Okay, so I'm going to stop it here, and this is our video 1 as we've broken down the different types of trauma and abuse. And there's one other one that I want to add in here that we haven't talked about, which is neglect. Now this one we see not causing as much of the trauma, but it is a type of abuse that, in my capacity as a therapist and as a psychologist, I have to assess for this many times, because if we have a parent who's on drugs, which I see far too many of those as well, and the child is being neglected, maybe their needs are not being met, maybe they don't have food in the home, maybe they don't have electricity or running water. That is a form of abuse that I have to let the authorities know about. But there are other ways that kids experience neglect, and that could be where they are not in the home, and maybe they are displaced somehow, and they're not getting their basic needs met. Okay, so I just wanted to mention that last one. Not necessarily as a trauma, but definitely as an abuse that we see as clinicians. Okay, so I'm going to stop it here. We're right at almost 25 minutes, and go ahead and take a break, stretch, and I'm going to step out of the way if you want to take a photo of this. I hope you were able to take some notes, but just to break this down. And when we come back for video 2, we'll address now how we begin to help our kiddos get through on the other side, okay? All right, thank you.